It was one of those nights that felt like it had been crafted by a writer in the early hours of the morning who was trying to see just how much fear they could cram into 48 hours. You know, the type of night where no matter what you do, you feel like you're doomed. This wasn't helped by the fact that I had an irrational fear of space, specifically an intense paranoia about the moon falling from the sky and crushing me to death. It all started the night before, when I was going through my regular nightly ritual of doom scrolling through social media on my phone. One video in particular caught my eye, which was a TikToker named Kay asking her followers, "What is your biggest fear?" Almost every response was some variation of being chased or kidnapped by a serial killer, the occasional tornado or car crash thrown in for good measure. But there was one answer that stood out amongst the rest. The moon falling from the sky, the user said. And underneath that, the moon falling from the sky echoed again and again. Well, this wouldn't have been the first time that I'd seen something like this. In fact, I'd seen this same question asked dozens of times across multiple different platforms. But something about the way that this user expressed their terror made me freeze. They described in vivid detail how they were outside one night when they saw the moon fall from the sky and get impossibly close to them, and then they woke up in a cold sweat. Then another user chimed in with their own story of how they too had dreamt of the moon falling from the sky. But it was watching them hovering outside their bedroom window, its surface shifting and changing until it took the form of a giant face. At first I tried to laugh off these stories as overactive imaginations. But as I continued scrolling, more and more stories of people seeing the moon fall popped up. And it was at this point that my gut reaction told me to stop reading and go to sleep. But instead, I decided to look up the scientific likelihood of the moon falling from the sky. What I found was not only unsatisfying, but also terrifying. As it turns out, the chances of the moon suddenly deciding to leave its orbit and plummet toward Earth are astronomically small. So small, in fact, that scientists say it would probably take a cosmic catastrophe for it to happen. Now, I didn't let myself think about what a cosmic catastrophe might entail. Instead, I went to bed without even brushing my teeth, which isn't even something I can do because I don't have any teeth. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the floorboard sounded like the moon settling into its death dive. And every time the curtains moved, it looked like the face from the TikTok video. Eventually, I got so freaked out that I turned my phone back on and spent a couple hours scouring Google for information on the moon falling. Most of what I found was pretty standard stuff. NASA has a whole webpage dedicated to answering the inevitable, what if the moon fell from the sky? And the answer, as you've already heard, is basically along the lines of, don't worry, it won't. But there was one website that stood out among the rest. This site was unlike any other NASA page I'd ever visited. It was cluttered with conspiracy theories and grainy images of the moon. The main articles seemed to be written by an amateur astronomer who was convinced that the moon was actually hollow and secretly man-made. But what really got my attention was a link in the sidebar titled, Moon Hoax Exposed. When I clicked on the link, it took me to a blurry image of the moon with a red circle drawn around what appeared to be a gigantic face. According to the caption, this photo was taken in 2006 by a Japanese spacecraft that was en route to the moon. But instead of showing us the far side of the moon, the spacecraft was inexplicably redirected so that it could capture the shocking image of an alien structure. Now, I know what you're thinking. Crazy conspiracy theory website that looks like it was designed in 1997. Well, you click on enough random links, you're bound to find something ridiculous. But what I found next brought the whole thing to a whole new level. I stumbled upon a forum thread on a popular message board filled with images supposedly taken by satellites, each of which showed something strange on the surface of the moon. These photos were taken at different times and from different angles, but they all seemed to show the same thing, a gargantuan, almost Lovecraftian face on the moon. I should mention here that everything I'm showing you in this video is either public domain footage or something I created myself. There's some stock footage in there too, but everything is sourced and linked in the description below. At this point, I was pretty sure that I was losing my mind. Surely, there's no way that I've never noticed a gigantic extraterrestrial face on the moon before. I mean, it's right there in plain sight. But I knew that if I stopped looking, the world would go back to normal. And so I did my best to focus on something else for a while. But after a few minutes, I started to hear a noise. It was incredibly subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was definitely there. It sounded like someone breathing heavily right outside my window. I told myself that it was probably just the wind, or maybe a bird. But I couldn't help but think of that second TikTok video where the girl was looking out her window and the moon was right there watching her breathing heavy. So obviously the rational thing to do would be to turn off all of my lights, pull the curtains completely, and then lie in bed and wait for sunrise. But instead I decided to grab a blanket and walk out onto my fire escape. Maybe if I couldn't hear whatever was out there, I could calm down. But what I found was only a pair of empty chairs. My super old and very unsafe fire escape is usually a great place to sit and contemplate life, especially since there's a full view of the moon. And so I did my best to look anywhere except at the moon. For a while, I sat in silence listening to the wind, but then I started to hear voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was something sinister and distorted about them. I don't want to make you think that I'm totally insane, so I'll just quote exactly what I wrote in my journal that night. There was something out there on the fire escape with me. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel eyes on me and the hair on my arms and neck stood on end. I felt like the entity was watching me, like it was sizing me up, deciding whether or not I was worth the effort. Okay, I know that sounds stupid. Do one try to tell me that a grown man in his 20s was genuinely scared of the supernatural on a fire escape? But the feeling that I had that night was unlike anything I've ever experienced before. And if there's one piece of advice I could give anyone who finds themselves in a situation like that, it would be to trust your gut. Thankfully, I followed my gut that night and noped out of there. I sprinted to my front door, fumbled with my keys, threw myself inside and locked it. As soon as I turned on all of the lights, the voices stopped. In the morning, I told my roommate about the experience, and he just laughed. Of course, he laughed because obviously I was insane. He didn't believe me, though. He thought that I was joking. I don't blame him. I wouldn't have believed me either, so I decided to keep it to myself. But that's not the end of the story. You see, the day after I experienced all of that, I went to work and forgot about it. But when I got home that night, the first thing I did was check the weather app on my phone. I didn't see anything unusual. It was supposed to be clear for the next few days. But when I stepped outside, I realized that it had been overcast the whole time. It hadn't cleared at all. And then I looked up at the moon and realized that it was gone. Now I know what you're thinking. The moon doesn't just disappear, Kyle, but it was gone. I scoured the sky and searched for clouds, but there was nothing. The moon was simply missing from the sky. Now, this isn't necessarily a scary thing, but combined with everything else that had happened the night before, it was really starting to freak me out. I checked a weather website, and it turned out that the moon was in its new moon phase, which meant that I was actually looking at the side of the moon that we usually do and see. The reason this is important is because the side of the moon that faces away from Earth is covered in craters. Craters that coincidentally look a lot like a face. It was at this point that I realized that I had been tricked. Whatever entity had been watching me on the fire escape the night before had also blinded me, causing me to miss the fact that the moon was in its new moon phase. I know that this sounds like a pretty elaborate prank, but consider this. Whoever, or whatever, was out there on my fire escape knew things about me that nobody else does. They knew that I would go outside to look at the moon. They knew that I would be scared if I couldn't see the moon. And most importantly, they knew that I would look at the wrong side of the moon. Had I fallen for the trap and looked at the far side of the moon, I would have seen the craters that are eerily similar to a giant face. And so I ask you, what was that face on the moon? And was it still watching me when I looked away?